My name is Neil. Welcome to the Aviator Show. Today we're going to do Motor Maintenance 101. We're going to try to demystify the fuel systems today. We're going to do a carburetor rebuild and change fuel lines, primer bulb, and potentially the clunk. Today we're going to work on a Parajet Mavic with an Atom 80. It's one of the most common paramotors in existence right now. It has a WB37 type carburetor, which is the same as found on your Moster, just tuned a little bit differently because being a smaller motor, it doesn't have nearly the same amount of fuel demands. We're going to work on that today, and this will cover some of the Moster as well. First thing we're going to do, airbox needs to come off. Let's take the hose clamp off. We're releasing it from the collar. Ensure that the snap lock, it's a 16mm Vittorazi snap lock. Make sure that's in good condition. This one is. This has been replaced recently. Also, this boot right here, this is a 100-hour maintenance item. What will happen is, over time, cracks will start to grow here, and potentially your airbox could come off completely and go into your prop and make a bad day. Or, with air flowing through these cracks rather than all the way up through here, you could potentially introduce a lean condition. And I've seen it before where that did cook a motor. Set this aside, and here we are. Here's the carburetor. We will use some pliers, get the pulse port hose off. What this is feeding vacuum from the crankcase. During the operation of an engine, it's creating vacuum as the stroke goes up and down. So, feeding vacuum from the crankcase to the carburetor. Carburetor itself runs off of vacuum. It acts as both a fuel pump and a metering system for your air to fuel. So this hose, all it does is transfer vacuum. This is another item you want to check for any sort of dry rot. It's a pretty thick hose, as you can see here, but obviously if there's a giant crack in it, you may be having problems anyway. Next we'll do fuel line. Pull this clamp up and over. This fuel line, we're going to replace it anyway, so if this clamp does give us too much trouble, it's not a big deal if we tear up the fuel line. There you go, Bob's your uncle. No fuel even came out. Throttle cable. This is easy. Just pop the cable itself out of the swivel. Next, we got two bolts that go all the way through the carburetor, 5mm. O-ring on the back here. We got this block here. We'll leave this intact. If you do take this off, make sure you put a new gasket behind it. So this is the Vittorazi handy box for the Atom 80. Comes with fuel line. There's a carb rebuild kit in here. Top end gaskets, reed gaskets, carburetor gaskets, O-rings, exhaust springs, random nuts and bolts, gear oil, pretty much everything that you might need on the road. These are really nice if you're at a fly-in and you have some issues with your motor and you need to do some field fixing. This has everything together for you. You can find these handy boxes on the Aviator website. Just search handy box. We keep them in stock. All right, so the carburetor is off. The next step is we're going to rebuild the carburetor. When looking for a rebuild kit, make sure you get actual Walbro kits. There's some Chinese knockoffs that can be very hit and miss. A lot of the parts are just lower quality and you could open yourself up to some issues. So I really recommend getting an actual Walbro rebuild kit, which is exactly what comes in these handy boxes. The easiest way to rebuild a carburetor, you got a lot of little parts in here, and this can be daunting for some people when you see all these tiny little parts. So the best way to do it is lay yourself out a nice shop towel or some sort of surface to work on, and we're going to do this in halves. So we've got the pump half of the carburetor. This is what fills the carburetor with fuel. This is what is pulling fuel from the tank. Is this pump diaphragm that's inside here that we'll see here shortly. This port right here was that pulse port that I was talking about earlier. This is where vacuum comes in, runs a little diaphragm, pulls fuel up from the tank into the fuel inlet, pumps it to the other side, to the metering side. Metering side is where the fuel to air mixture is set from different ports in here, different drilled holes, and there's a spring in here that sets a certain pressure that it has to run off of. It can seem like a lot at first, but you'll get used to understanding how these things work, and they're actually quite simple. We will start on the pump side first. The way to do it is to do it in halves, and as you're taking parts apart, lay them out in order. And then when you go to put them back together, everything will be in order. Your diaphragms will be in the correct position. And you'll see here in a little bit when I'm talking about that. Got a little torque seal here we'll have to scratch off. I typically rebuild my carbs once a year, especially when you start noticing the idle is starting to get erratic and nothing has really changed in the weather. Seasonal changes will affect your carburetor tuning. So these 4 screws here, we'll set these aside. Pull this cover off. Set this like this. We have first a gasket, and then the diaphragm is underneath that gasket. So as you can see, there's a gasket, and then the diaphragm is underneath that gasket. So I'm going to lay this down like this. That's the order that it came off. We've got a little screen here. We're going to pull that out with a little screwdriver. The rebuild kit comes with a new one. All right, that side's opened up. Now we're going to work the other side. All right, so we're going on to the metering side. Pretty much same thing. 4 little screws. All right, 4 screws removed. Pull this cover off. Now you see on this side, we have the diaphragm first, and then the gasket is underneath it. So this side is going to be the opposite order of the pump side. Peel this off. This little tab here, see how we have a little tab? This slides into this metering lever here, like that. It stays in place. That's how you know you've got it on correctly. So we'll set that like that. And we'll pull gasket off. Set gasket like that. This is the metering side. There's metering lever, needle valve. There's a spring under this metering lever that we'll see here shortly. Then we've got the metering circuit right here under this cover. So we're going to pull that off. All right, so we're pulling this cover off. Same thing, keeping everything in order, because there's a gasket and a diaphragm under this too, as you can see there. This we will just set aside just like that. Next is to pull metering lever and the needle out. There's this little screw here. Put your thumb over it so the spring doesn't shoot out and you lose that spring, and they're kind of hard to find unless you have a really good chainsaw shop down the road. And they have the actual correct one that you need. Oh yeah, it's nice and chunky in there. Spring and needle. This is a disassembled carburetor. What we'll do next is we will put this in the ultrasonic cleaner, because this thing is an absolute mess. It's disgusting, it's terrible. The person that owns this machine should be ashamed of themselves. And yeah, we'll clean her up. So this one, I had used the ultrasonic cleaners. We have that on hand. It does a really good job, but I'm going to show you guys the most common way of cleaning a carburetor. It's been used for a very long time, and this is most likely the way you will be doing yours. So gum out carb choke cleaner, hose it down, hit it with some air. Set that over there. Same thing for this one. We're just kind of cleaning the covers off just a little bit, make them look a little nice. Really clean the pulse port out with some air. Make sure that's clear. All right, now this is the main part that you want to really hit with some carb cleaner. All these little ventries and ports and holes and this, that, and the other thing need to be cleaned out. It's the whole point of taking the carburetor apart, is putting new diaphragms in it and making sure all of your crustaceans are out of here. Our hose dousing it down good. Any little ports that you can see in here, give them a good splash of carb cleaner. Clean the outside of it as well. Any little hole or port that you can find, go ahead and blast it. You're not going to hurt nothing when it's been disassembled this far. We have a clean carburetor. So we're going to open up our rebuild kit here. So we've got new gaskets. We're going to start on the metering side first. Now, these kits come with a few different configurations. That gasket goes over there. So as you can see, this gasket does not look like that gasket. As you can see through here, there's a little bit of a screen. This flapper valve goes over that like that. And that's going to actuate right there where that fuel's coming in. Now we got to find the gasket for that. That looks like that. Set that up like so. We need our metering diaphragm. Now earlier I was talking about this little tab. Make sure that in your rebuild kit, this diaphragm looks like your old one, which it does. This is the order that it will be assembled. When you find metering lever, this is new, little rod that it pivots on, and our brand new needle. So we'll start with the metering lever and needle. Remember this spring? This is where the pop-off pressure is introduced. We will talk about that here in a minute. I'm going to take some two-stroke oil and put it onto the end of this needle. Just a tiny dab is all we need. And you'll see why I'm doing that here in a second. Set that in there. Metering spring here, and then the needle goes in this big deep hole here. Our rod goes through here like this, and we're going to need, there it is. This little screw here is going to hold it all in place. So this can be a little tricky. You've got to get this little bracket here, goes into the slot on the needle. That's going to pop in there like that. And then make sure that the spring goes into this little detent here in the metering lever. Hold it down with your thumb. You gotta put the screw in, tighten her up just a little bit. There you go. All right, so this is our needle and metering lever. We're going to set the metering height. This here is a tool I picked up from Chad Bastian and miniplane.com. These are Walbro metering height gauges. This is a custom one for a WG8 carburetor. So this little tab here is what we're going to use to set our metering height. It lays across like this, and I'm going to drag it across the top surface of the carb. I don't know if you'll be able to pick it up on camera, but you can barely see. I'm just barely hitting it and moving it. That's like actually perfect. So this is what is going to set the pop-off and rest. You're basically setting the tension on the spring. So let's say this thing was way too high and we need to bring it down. So we put a little bit of pressure over here, and this is just an aluminum piece, so you're changing that height. So now if we show it, it's much lower than it was. If we want to raise it, get your screwdriver, go underneath it, and pry up on it. And now it's too high. See, I'm getting blocked. I can't go past that. So what you're looking for is you can slide the gauge over it, and it just barely moves the metering lever. So our metering height is set. Start putting our diaphragms back together. This one first. So you've got the gasket, then the diaphragm, then the cover. Line this all up. It fits in kind of a half moon looking space here. Once you get it all lined up, it just kind of drops in. Holes look good. Now these little angled screws here that are flatheads are the ones that hold this particular diaphragm in. Now we'll put the metering diaphragm on. Gasket goes first. There's these little pins here that your diaphragm and your gasket seat into. Remember I was telling you this tab again, this needs to slide into this slot on the metering lever. So bring it in like this. Now it's in there. You can pull up a little bit on the diaphragm and tell that it's in there, and then it popped out and now it's back in. Okay, now we'll put the cover back on. All right, metering side is done. Now we'll go to the pump side. So we're gonna put the screen in and then take maybe an Allen wrench. All it's gotta do is fit down in there and be even, not cocked to one side or something like that. Get it down in there so it won't come out. That's really all you're doing, just get it in there. In these rebuild kits, you'll see two types of diaphragms. Rubbery looking deal, and then this almost fibrous looking clear diaphragm. This is supposed to be more resistant to ethanol. It's also supposed to work better in cold weather. I've been putting these ones in and have had pretty good luck with them, so I'm gonna go ahead and stick with that process. So if you remember, when we pulled our covers off, we put things in order. Diaphragm goes first, and you're lining up. The flappers in the diaphragm here are aligned with these holes. You've got two holes on this side, one on this side. See how that lines up? That's how you know you got it on the correct way. And pretty much same thing with the gasket here. That looks correct. We'll put the cover on. This cover has pins in it as well, and you'll be able to move it around like this, and it'll feel like it's in there securely. Put screws on. All right, there's a carb rebuild. We're not done yet. We need to do the pop off and rest pressure. All right, so this is a pop off and rest gauge. You can order these online. We'll put the link in the description. Basically what this is used for is in the motorcycle world for measuring fine pressure. You got pretty accurate gauge here. They're about 50 bucks, somewhere around there. This works really great for rebuilding carburetors, so you can measure the pop off and rest pressure, so you can track what your carburetor is actually doing. So what we're looking for with the Atom 80 WB37 type carburetor, we're looking for a pop off of 15 to 16. So when you're pumping it up, when the gauge suddenly drops, when that needle has particularly popped off, that's what we're looking for. And we're also looking for the rest pressure, when that needle seats back in the carburetor body itself. So that rest pressure should be above 10 psi. So we're looking for 15, 16 pop off and above 10 for rest. We've checked the pop off. Pop off looked good. Pop off and rest. Putting the cover back on here. Now we have a rebuilt carburetor. See how much cleaner it is? Doesn't look beautiful. I think the owner of this Paramotor will be thrilled to see a nice clean carburetor on there. The next step in our fuel system maintenance is going to be changing out the fuel line. This is a great time, you'll love it. As you can see here, this Polini primer bulb that I was pointing out earlier, if you can zoom in there, we got some cracking going on. You start seeing things like this, you can introduce leakage into the fuel system, and the way these fuel systems work, with the fuel pump being the carburetor itself, it doesn't take a lot of leaking in the system for it to start causing a lot of problems. That's why I recommend replacing your fuel lines once a year. I'm sure there's people that go way longer than that, but they're getting stiff. They're not cracking or anything yet, but you can tell they've had better days. We're gonna pull all this off. The Mavics have a little standoff here for the primer bulb. It's gonna be a 4mm Allen wrench and 10mm wrench on the back. Okay. Before replacing the fuel lines and the primer bulb, we'll go ahead and drain the tank because I think we're gonna change a clunk on this thing too. Hopefully you have one of these things, a jiggle tube. You can usually get them at Harbor Freight or Menards or a few other hardware stores. Fuel's out of the tank. Got an empty fuel tank. All right, fuel line removal. Clamp back here. There. We can go ahead and pull the harness off here so we can get a little more room. Okay, changing the clunk. That's what we're doing here to remove this fitting off the tank. We're also going to need to grab the clunk because you can't pull that through, right? All right, so this is some regular house wire. So you're gonna need a piece of this in order to do the clunk. This is just some housing wire. You could potentially use a coat hanger, something that's got some rigidity to it so you can shape it and bend it and work around corners, anything like that. So we need to fish the clunk. This is the most challenging part of all of this, really, especially with this style of fuel tank. I didn't want that to happen. In the event that you put the fuel line in the tank, accidentally dropping it, the next step is probably to take the fuel tank off. All right, there's a Mavic tank. So I can see that fuel line that I dropped in there, it's right there. It's a lot easier to get to it when the fuel tank is off. And there's quite a bit of sediment in there. That's why we changed the clunk. Ah. There we go. See this schmutz here and some schmagma, and yeah, not in great shape. There's some bugs in there. There's some dirt. So next step of the process is we need to cut some fuel line exactly the old length. Grab some fuel line out of the handy box. So this is our nice, clean, white, pure white, new clunk and some new fuel line. Now you may need to use a little bit of oil to get the fuel line on. We'll try it without first. Well, we're gonna put a zip tie over this one. Clunk generally stays submerged, so fuel leakage here isn't an enormous problem, but if you lose the clunk off the fuel line, let's say this clunk slipped out of here, it was sitting down in the bottom of the tank, it slipped out, and then your fuel line curls up like this, it's obviously not going to be sucking any fuel in. So you're more worried about it being secure on here than actually sealing. So we're going to double loop a zip tie. It's not going nowhere. Now I'm going to mimic the length of this fuel line here. Make sure you use nice sharp cutters. Try and cut it straight. So this fuel line here is quite stiff. Be careful when you're using a knife that you don't cut into the aluminum. Peel it off. There we go. Trash. This is going to be the challenging part because this clunk won't fit through here. We need to feed this end of the fuel line through our fill hole into here. All right, I can see the wire. Use this, make a hook out of this. Oh, baby, I got you. I got you. Okay, now we have a complete wire through where we need to go. You want to make sure that when you're putting your wire through the fuel line, you go pretty deep on it. That'll keep the wire from sliding out of the fuel line and taking it right back to square one. See, got it back through. All right, it's been fed. Make sure that the threaded end, it's gonna go in like this. Don't put it on the wrong way. You won't need a clamp up here. It didn't come with one because simply the fact that it'll be hard to fit into this fitting if you had a clamp on there. don't know if you'll be able to see there, but the clunk goes all the way to the bottom of the fuel can. Doesn't need to be mega tight, just something like that. Alrighty, fuel tank back on. Was able to successfully remount the Mavic fuel tank. It was actually pretty smooth sailing on this one. I don't think the owners had too many butt landings with this frame in particular, so right on, good job. We're going to recreate this part right here. So we'll recreate this line here. And all I'm doing is kind of laying the fuel line across about there. And we'll make one up here. Try and cut these as straight as you can. Just makes the fitting a lot better. This is our new primer bulb here. When you're setting up a new primer bulb, there's an arrow. This arrow exists to show you which way the fuel is supposed to flow. So it's going to suck in on this end, blow out this end. This part can be challenging because these barbs here are fairly large for this fuel line. I try to put them on dry first. Try to go all the way down. It's just going to take some brute force to get it the rest of the way. You want to make sure that the fuel line is down as far as it'll go. Any more contact that you can make with this barb, the more seal that you'll have. If you're having trouble getting it on there, let's say it's just not happening, take a little bit of two-stroke oil, get it down in there just a little bit. Now, the downside to this, it's almost too easy and it may want to keep sliding off on you. So you may have to pop it off, wipe it down a little bit. Really only need just a little bit of two-stroke oil on there. This one's holding on pretty good. All right, so our fuel line is positioned. So next part is getting the clamp onto the barb. Some pliers, work it back and forth. We're gonna put the fuel line onto the tank. Same thing, get it on there as far down as possible. And the more surface contact you can make, the better sealing it is. We're gonna mount the primer bulb to the frame next. Again, this is a 4mm and a 10mm. When you're tightening this up, make sure that you're not introducing a large kink into the fuel line that would potentially block your fuel flow. Now we got a reattached carburetor. So we're gonna put the O-ring in here. The new O-ring does come with a handy box. Seat that down into the groove like so. We've got a new carburetor gasket. Actually got two of them. Each one goes on either side of this rubber block here. Make sure that the surfaces are nice and clean. Now you'll see this hole here doesn't matter on the MY20s, but MY19 had an internal pulse port at one point, so you had to line this hole up. And there was a hole on this block here, on this carb flange. As you can see, that no longer exists. Obviously, to make the gaskets fit properly, line everything up. What I'm doing here is just making a stack. Help line everything up a little easier. That's our stack. We've got the two gaskets, spacer, the air boot horn. Then this is going to be a torque spec item. These two bolts that go all the way through the carburetor. Torque specs, carburetor connecting screws, 5.5 Newton meters. Bring the torque wrench down to 5.5 Newton meters. Way down here, 5.54 Allen sockets. We're compressing those gaskets right now. There's one. There's two. I'm gonna reconnect the pulse port hose. Put the air box back on. We're gonna tighten this hose clamp back down. We'll need to hook up the throttle as well. Fuel system has been refreshened. Carburetor's been rebuilt, pop-off's been checked. All new fuel lines, all new primer bulb. We'll just have to finish up putting the harness together, put some fuel in it, and we're good to go. Good? Like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff. If you have any ideas for some episodes that you would like to see, go ahead and leave a comment in the comment section. Thanks a lot.